The room fell silent the moment the wealthy heir lifted his glass. Crystal chandeliers reflected across the polished floor, and every guest in the grand ballroom slowly turned their attention toward him. No one expected the words that were about to leave his mouth. In a single moment, he would humiliate the woman who had stood beside him for years. Years. What he didn't realize was that the quiet woman he believed was ordinary was hiding a truth powerful enough to change everything. The evening had been planned as a celebration. Business partners, social elites, and influential families filled the luxurious hall. Soft music played while waiters moved gracefully between guests carrying silver trays of drinks. The heir stood confidently among them, wearing the kind of smile that came from a lifetime of privilege. His family had been wealthy for generations, and he had grown up believing success and respect were his birthright. Beside him stood his wife. She looked calm, almost distant, as she quietly observed the crowd. Her dress was elegant but simple, lacking the dramatic style many other guests wore. Some people in the room glanced at her with curiosity. Others whispered quietly behind polite smiles. Their world, appearance and reputation meant everything. Many wondered why a man with such a powerful name had married a woman who seemed so quiet and private. But she didn't react to the whispers. Her eyes moved slowly across the room as if she were studying the people around her rather than worrying about their opinions. Anyone paying close attention might have noticed the confidence in her posture or the calm intelligence behind her gaze, but most people never looked closely enough to see it. The heir finally tapped his glass with a small spoon, drawing attention from every corner of the ballroom. The music stopped, conversations faded. Even the waiters paused. He cleared his throat and looked around proudly. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began with a confident tone. "This evening is important to me because it represents a new chapter in my life." The guests nodded politely, expecting a speech about business expansion or family success, but then his words took a different direction. "Sometimes," he continued, "we make decisions that we later realize were mistakes." A few people exchanged confused looks. His wife remained perfectly still. The heir turned slightly toward her. "When I got married," he said slowly, "I believed love was enough to build a future. But I've learned that in our world, partnership requires more than emotion. It requires equality in ambition, status, and vision." The tension in the room began to rise. His wife looked at him calmly, as if she already knew what was coming. "I've decided," he continued, "that it's time for me to correct that mistake." A quiet gasp moved through the audience. The meaning of his words was suddenly clear. "In front of all of you," he said confidently, "I am ending my marriage." Silence filled the ballroom. Some guests stared in shock. Others leaned closer, unable to believe what they were hearing. A few people glanced toward the woman beside him, waiting for a reaction, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him. The heir continued speaking, unaware that every word was slowly revealing more about his character than hers. "I believe a person in my position needs a partner who truly represents the life I am building. He's someone who understands the world of influence and legacy." His words hung in the air like a quiet insult. Then he gave a small dismissive gesture. "Unfortunately, that isn't the life my wife belongs in." The cruelty of the statement made several guests uncomfortable. Even some of his business partners shifted uneasily in their seats. Finally, everyone's attention turned toward the woman he had just humiliated. For a moment, she said nothing. She slowly removed the ring from her finger. Her calm expression surprised many people in the room. There was no anger in her eyes, no desperation, only quiet acceptance. She placed the ring gently on the table beside him. "I hope you find the future you're looking for," she said softly. Her voice was steady. The heir seemed almost disappointed by her lack of emotion. Perhaps he had expected a dramatic reaction, something that would confirm his belief that she needed him. Instead, she simply stepped away from the table, from the turville. The sound of her heels crossing the marble floor echoed through the silent ballroom as she walked toward the exit. Not once did she look back. The heavy doors closed behind her, and the whispers began immediately. Guests leaned together, quietly discussing the shocking scene they had just witnessed. Some criticized the heir's behavior, while others tried to pretend the moment hadn't been as uncomfortable as it felt. But the heir remained standing confidently at the center of the room. To him, the situation was finished. He believed he had just removed an obstacle from his life. What he didn't know was that the woman walking calmly through the dark parking lot outside carried a secret that none of those powerful guests could even imagine. She paused beside a sleek black car waiting near the entrance. The driver quickly stepped out and opened the door. "Good evening, ma'am," he said respectfully. She gave a small nod before stepping inside. As the car pulled away from the glowing lights of the mansion, her phone vibrated softly. A message appeared from her assistant. The board meeting is ready whenever you are. The investors are waiting. She looked out the window at the quiet city streets. For a moment, the reflection in the glass showed the calm expression she had carried all night. Then she typed a short reply. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The car accelerated smoothly into the night. Behind her, the ballroom celebration slowly returned to life, filled with laughter and conversations as if nothing important had happened. But somewhere far across the city, a different room filled with powerful people was preparing for the arrival of a woman they respected deeply, a woman whose decisions controlled companies, industries, and billions of dollars. And none of them would ever imagine that only minutes earlier she had been publicly dismissed as someone unworthy of standing beside a wealthy heir. By the time the truth reached him, the damage would already be done. Morning sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the heir's luxurious penthouse, casting long golden lines across the polished floor. The city below was already awake, but inside the quiet apartment, he slept peacefully, unaware that the events of the previous night were already spreading through conversations across the city. When he finally woke, the first thing he felt was relief. To him, the situation had ended exactly as he wanted. The marriage he believed had held him back was now finished, and he felt certain that his future would be stronger without it. As he stepped out of bed and looked across the skyline, he smiled with quiet satisfaction. His phone buzzed several times on the bedside table. Messages from friends and business associates filled the screen. Most of them congratulated him. Some praised his confidence for making such a bold decision publicly. Others joked that a man of his status should have made that choice years ago. In his world, reputation and appearances mattered deeply, and many people believed he had simply corrected an unfortunate mistake. He dressed carefully for work, choosing an expensive suit that reflected the powerful image he liked to project. Before leaving the apartment, he paused briefly in front of the large mirror in the hallway. For a moment, he thought about the calm expression his wife had shown the night before. But he quickly pushed the thought away. In his mind, her silence had only confirmed his belief that she had never truly belonged in his world. Across the city, however, the woman he had divorced was beginning a very different morning. Her car stopped in front of a tall glass building that reflected the rising sunlight. The structure was modern and elegant, standing quietly among other corporate towers. Few people walking past the entrance knew that inside those walls, decisions were made that influenced companies across multiple continents. The driver stepped out and opened the door for her. "Good morning, Mom," he said respectfully. She nodded gently before walking toward the entrance. As soon as she stepped into the building, the atmosphere changed. Several employees straightened their posture immediately, offering polite greetings as she passed. "Good morning. Welcome back. Your meeting is ready upstairs." Their voices carried a tone of deep respect. Inside the elevator, her assistant was already waiting with a digital tablet filled with reports. "Good morning," the assistant said with a warm smile. "The board members arrived early, weren't Board members arrived early. They're waiting in the conference room." The woman glanced briefly at the screen. Investment summaries, international partnerships, and expansion proposals filled the display. Numbers that represented enormous financial movements scrolled past with quiet precision. "Let's begin," she said calmly. Moments later, the doors of the conference room opened. Inside, several executives stood as she entered. These were leaders of powerful companies, people who commanded industries and influenced global markets. Yet they greeted her with clear admiration. One of the senior partners spoke first. "We're glad you're here. The final approval is needed before we move forward." She walked to the head of the long conference table and reviewed the documents carefully. The room remained silent while everyone waited for her decision. After a few minutes, she signed the agreement. Just like that, billions of dollars in new investments were set into motion. For her, it was simply another normal morning. Meanwhile, the heir arrived at his family's corporate headquarters feeling just as confident as he had earlier. The building carried the legacy of his family name, and employees greeted him with polite respect as he walked through the lobby. Inside the executive boardroom, several directors were already waiting. "Good morning," one of them said. "We were just discussing last night's event." A few people laughed quietly. The heir sat comfortably at the head of the table. "Yes," he replied casually. "Sometimes it's better to fix a mistake sooner rather than later." The others nodded, though not everyone looked completely comfortable with the situation. Even in their world of ambition and status, public humiliation carried a certain level of risk. But the heir dismissed their concerns easily. To him, the matter was closed. As the meeting continued, one of the younger executives suddenly glanced down at his tablet with a puzzled expression. "Has anyone seen this?" he asked. The large screen on the wall lit up with a breaking financial news report. A major global network had just released an announcement about an upcoming press conference involving a mysterious business leader. According to the report, the individual controlled a powerful investment empire that had quietly acquired stakes in multiple international corporations. The analysts on the screen were already discussing the potential impact. If these reports are accurate, one expert said, this could be one of the most influential business figures in the world. The heir barely paid attention. His focus remained on his own company's expansion plans. But in another building across the city, preparations were being made for that very announcement. Cameras were being arranged. Reporters were gathering. Investors were waiting. Inside a private office overlooking the skyline, the woman sat quietly while her assistant reviewed the schedule. The press conference begins in 2 hours, the assistant explained. Once the announcement is made, your identity will finally be public. The woman nodded calmly. For years she had chosen privacy over recognition. She had built her empire carefully, allowing her work to speak louder than her name. But the events of the previous night had changed something. Not because she felt embarrassed, but because she no longer saw any reason to remain invisible. Her assistant hesitated before speaking again. There's something else, she added. Former husband's company is one of the firms indirectly connected to our investment network. The woman looked up slightly. Interesting, she replied quietly. Outside the window, the city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware that a single revelation later that day would send shockwaves through the financial world. And somewhere across town, a man who had proudly ended his marriage still believed he had walked away from someone ordinary. He had no idea that the next headline he read would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he had just thrown out of his life. The news alert appeared on screens across the city just before noon. Financial networks interrupted their regular programs. Reporters gathered outside a towering conference hall. Fora and investors around the world leaned closer to their monitors. A mysterious business leader was about to reveal the identity behind one of the most powerful private investment empires anyone had ever seen. Inside the hall, hundreds of journalists filled the seats, their cameras pointed toward the empty stage. The air carried a quiet tension, the kind that appeared only when something historic was about to happen. Analysts had spent the entire morning speculating about who the leader could be. Some believed it was an unknown technology billionaire. Others thought it might be a group of international investors working secretly together, but no one had guessed the truth. Across town, the wealthy heir was finishing a routine meeting inside his company's boardroom. The large glass windows showed the busy streets far below, while executives reviewed reports and expansion plans. One of the younger directors suddenly looked up from his tablet. Something big is happening on the financial networks, he said. Another executive picked up the remote and turned on the large screen mounted on the wall. Instantly the room filled with the image of a crowded press conference hall. The heir barely glanced at it at first. He assumed it was another corporate announcement that had nothing to do with him. But the reporters on the screen sounded unusually excited. We are moments away from the public appearance of the founder behind one of the fastest growing investment empires in modern business history. i.e. Anchor said. This organization controls major stakes in technology, energy, real estate, and global infrastructure. The boardroom fell slightly quieter as everyone listened. The analyst continued speaking. For years, the identity of the founder has remained completely private. Today, for the first time, the world will finally see who built this massive empire. Even the heir's attention shifted toward the screen. Meanwhile, at the conference hall, the doors behind the stage slowly opened. Several senior executives walked out first, taking their seats along the long table, facing the reporters. Their expressions showed the confidence of people who were used to controlling billion-dollar decisions. Then, a moment later, the final person stepped onto the stage. The room instantly filled with the sound of camera flashes. At first, the image on the television screen was partially blocked by photographers moving for a better view. But when the cameras finally cleared, the entire face of the speaker became visible. Inside the boardroom across the city, silence crashed down like a sudden storm. The heir froze. His eyes locked onto the screen. The woman standing confidently at the podium looked calm, professional, and completely composed. She wore a simple but elegant suit, and her voice carried the kind of steady authority that commanded attention. It was his ex-wife. For a moment, no one in the boardroom spoke. Several executives slowly turned their heads toward the heir, their expressions filled with disbelief. On the screen, she began speaking to the reporters. "Thank you all for being here today," she said calmly. "For many years, I have chosen to keep my identity private. While building the companies and partnerships that form our investment network." Her voice was steady, clear, and confident. "But today," she continued, "I believe transparency will allow us to move forward with new opportunities." A reporter quickly raised a hand. "Can you confirm that you are the sole founder of this investment empire?" She nodded. "Yes." Another wave of camera flashes filled the room. "Our organization currently holds major shares in over 200 international companies," she explained. "Our goal has always been to create long-term partnerships that strengthen industries and support innovation." The numbers appearing on the screen were staggering. Billions of dollars in assets, global corporate influence, major partnerships across multiple industries. Back in the boardroom, the heir felt his chest tighten. The woman he had publicly dismissed only a day earlier was now calmly explaining an empire larger than many national economies. One of the directors leaned closer to the screen, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's your ex-wife." Heir didn't respond. His mind replayed the scene from the ballroom the night before, his own voice announcing the divorce, the shocked faces of the guests. Quiet dignity she had shown as she removed her ring and walked away. Now the same woman stood in front of hundreds of reporters, speaking with the confidence of someone who had built something extraordinary. Another reporter asked a question. "Why did you remain anonymous for so long?" She paused briefly before answering. "I preferred to let the work speak for itself," she said. "Recognition was never my goal." Her answer was simple, but the meaning behind it was powerful. The heir's hands slowly tightened on the edge of the table. Around him, the board members watched the screen with growing realization. Some of them were already recognizing company names listed under her investment group. Several of those companies were connected to their own business operations, which meant something even more shocking. Her influence might already reach into their company. On the screen, the press conference continued. An analyst asked another question. "With such enormous success, what motivated you to reveal your identity now?" For the first time, she paused a little longer before speaking. Her expression remained calm, but her answer carried quiet strength. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "life reminds you that there is no reason to hide who you are." Baki Sol Tor. Pierre felt those words land like a weight in his chest, because deep down, he knew exactly what moment she was talking about. The room around him remained silent. The directors were no longer paying attention to him as their boss. They were staring at the screen, watching the rise of a woman whose power had just become visible to the entire world. And the man who had humiliated her in front of a ballroom full of guests was now sitting frozen in his chair, realizing something that made his confidence crumble. He hadn't just lost a marriage. He had publicly rejected one of the most powerful business leaders alive. And the consequences of that mistake were only beginning to unfold. Silence inside the boardroom stretched longer than anyone expected. No one moved, no one spoke. The large screen continued broadcasting the press conference, but the attention of every executive in the room had shifted from the news to the man sitting at the head of the table. The wealthy heir stared at the screen as if the image might suddenly change, but it didn't. The woman speaking confidently to reporters was the same woman who had quietly stood beside him for years. The same woman he had publicly dismissed in front of an entire ballroom. Only now, the world saw her very differently. On the television, reporters continued asking questions while cameras flashed continuously. "Your investment network has expanded faster than almost any private organization in modern history," one journalist said. "How were you able to build something of this scale without public attention?" She answered calmly. "By focusing on long-term partnerships rather than public recognition. When the work is strong, attention eventually follows on its own." Her voice carried a quiet certainty that filled the entire hall. Back in the boardroom, one of the senior directors slowly leaned back in his chair. His expression was no longer just surprised, it was calculating. "Do you realize what this means?" he asked quietly. Another executive nodded while studying. "Our company has indirect partnerships with at least 3 firms listed under her investment group." The heir finally looked away from the screen. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice tight. "I'm saying," the director replied carefully, "that the business world we operate in may already be connected to her decisions." That realization made the atmosphere in the room even heavier. The heir felt a cold wave of uncertainty moving through his mind. Just yesterday, he believed he had complete control over his future. Now he was beginning to understand that the woman he had humiliated might hold far more influence than he ever imagined. On the screen, the press conference continued. A reporter stood and asked another question. "Many people are curious about your personal life. You've built an enormous business empire, yet very little is known about your private world. Have you always kept your life separate from your work?" For the first time, the room of reporters noticed a faint pause. She answered calmly, "Yes. Privacy has always allowed me to focus on building something meaningful." Another journalist raised a hand quickly. "Were you ever married?" The question spread a small ripple of curiosity through the audience. For a moment, she simply looked across the room. Then she nodded. "She nor or one." Cameras flashed again. "But that chapter of my life ended recently," she added. Her tone remained respectful, but firm enough to signal that she would not discuss it further. Back in the boardroom, several executives slowly turned their heads toward the heir again. No one needed to say anything. The connection was up. The heir felt their eyes on him. His jaw tightened slightly. The press conference soon ended with applause from investors and business leaders seated in the front rows. She stepped away from the podium. Journalists continued shouting questions, hoping to get one final comment. But she simply smiled politely and exited the stage. The broadcast shifted back to financial analysts who immediately began discussing the enormous impact of her public appearance. "This changes the global investment landscape," one expert said. "Her organization has quietly positioned itself at the center of multiple industries," an analyst added. "What's remarkable is the discipline it took to build something this powerful while remaining invisible for so long." Inside the boardroom, the television was finally turned off. For a few seconds, the room stayed silent. Then one of the directors spoke carefully. "You didn't know?" The heir's expression hardened. "No," he replied. Another executive shook his head slowly. "That woman controls companies worth billions," he said. "And yesterday you divorced her in front of half the city's most influential people." The words felt heavier when spoken aloud. The heir stood from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Cars moved through the streets below like tiny silver lines, completely unaware that his world had just shifted. His mind replayed every moment of the previous night. Her calm face, her quiet words, the way she placed the ring on the table without anger. At the time, he thought her silence meant weakness. Now he understood something very different. She hadn't argued because she didn't need to. Behind him, the board members were already discussing business implications. "If her company increases its influence in our sector, we may eventually need to negotiate partnerships with them," executive said. Another nodded. "That means we could end up sitting across the table from her." The heir slowly turned around. The idea of facing her again suddenly felt very different from what it would have been just a day ago. Yesterday he believed he held the higher position. Now the balance had shifted completely. Later that evening, the story continued spreading through news outlets, social media, and financial reports. People admired the dignity she had shown both during the press conference and during the public divorce that was now being quietly discussed by those who had witnessed it. Many praised her for maintaining grace despite the humiliation. Others simply admired the strength it took to build such a powerful empire without seeking attention. Meanwhile, the heir sat alone in his office, long after his employees had gone home. The lights of the city reflected in the glass around him, but he barely noticed them. First time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar, regret, not because of the money or power she possessed, but because he was beginning to realize something far more painful. While he had spent years believing he was the successful one, she had been quietly building a legacy far greater than anything he had achieved. And now that the truth had finally been revealed to the world, one question remained in his mind. He destroyed something priceless simply because he never bothered to understand the woman who stood beside him. The next morning, the city seemed quieter than usual, though in truth it was anything but. Financial news channels continued to analyze the revelation from the previous day. Investors were calling meetings, and analysts were running simulations of what the woman's empire could mean for global markets. Yet for the wealthy heir, the world felt smaller and heavier at the same time. He arrived at his office earlier than usual, hoping to focus on work and push aside the unease gnawing at him. But as he stepped into the building, he noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere. Staff members whispered quietly among themselves. Executives glanced at him with a mix of sympathy and caution. Something had changed overnight, though he didn't fully understand what it meant yet. His assistant handed him a tablet filled with overnight news alerts. Headlines screamed the same story: the hidden billionaire revealed. Or purported, screamed billionaire, for hidden billionaire revealed. Ex-wife controls global investment empire. He scrolled through article after article, each detailing her accomplishments, her strategic acquisitions, and the scale of influence she had built silently over the years. He stopped on a segment highlighting one of her recent international deals. The transaction had been completed months earlier, yet none of the public had known. The deal had affected markets, stock prices, and corporate strategies, all without anyone realizing who had orchestrated it. Realization. He had not merely divorced a woman, he had dismissed someone whose decisions now shaped industries that he relied upon daily. Every arrogant thought he had held the night before, now, felt foolish. Across town, the woman moved through her office with the calm precision she always displayed. She had no intention of seeking revenge. There was no dramatic confrontation planned. To her, the past was already behind her. What mattered now was the future she had been building quietly for years, and that future was expanding at a pace no one could ignore. Her assistant brought the latest reports from international markets. She reviewed the numbers swiftly. Acquisitions, mergers, all orchestrated seamlessly to strengthen her growing network. Each decision was precise, calculated, and impactful. She had always worked like this, meticulously, without fanfare, letting the results speak louder than words. A senior executive entered the office, clearly nervous. "Ma'am," he began carefully, "your presence on the press stage yesterday. The market is reacting positively. Investors are praising your leadership, and interest from new partners is increasing dramatically." She nodded, her calm expression unchanging. "Good," she replied. "We move forward as planned. No need to overstate anything. Focus on execution." Back in his office, the heir sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his mind racing. He had spent his life measuring himself against status, money, and appearances, believing that his wealth guaranteed power. The woman he had discarded had demonstrated, in less than 24 hours, a level of influence and intelligence that dwarfed his own. First time, he felt vulnerability. Not financial vulnerability, but a personal one. He had underestimated her completely. Every arrogant assumption he had made, every slight he had cast her way, now seemed painfully small in comparison to the truth he had ignored. He remembered the night at the ballroom, replaying the details with a clarity he could not escape. The calmness of her expression as he spoke, the dignity in the way she removed the ring and walked out, the quiet strength she had displayed, all of it had been a warning he had failed to recognize. His colleagues, noticing his distracted state, began asking questions about the next steps for ongoing projects. Responded mechanically, though every word felt hollow. The weight of realization pressed heavily on him. His ex-wife was not only a remarkable business leader, but someone whose vision and strategy had already begun to shape his world in ways he could not control. Meanwhile, she continued her work with unshakable composure. The press coverage, the sudden public attention, it was irrelevant to her focus. She had built her empire quietly and had no need for validation. But as she expanded her influence, she became increasingly aware of one unavoidable truth. The man who had tried to humiliate her was still out there, still operating in the same circles, underestimating her. Her thoughts did not dwell on, yet she understood that her actions in the coming days would inevitably intersect with his life. Every business decision she made could, intentionally or not, influence his company, his decisions, and his standing in the industry. The heir, unaware of the precise magnitude of her influence, began to notice subtle disruptions in his usual operation. Meetings that were once routine now involved complications from unexpected partners. Investments he had assumed were secure began showing volatility tied to networks he had never noticed before. The realization grew unbounded. The woman he had believed was ordinary had quietly orchestrated a web of power that now affected every corner of his business, and he had treated her as insignificant. By evening, the heir found himself pacing his office, staring out at the city skyline, unable to stop thinking about the woman who had walked out of his life with grace. Every instinct told him that he had underestimated her, that he had made a mistake far larger than any financial loss. He had assumed control over his life, his decisions, and his relationships, but one revelation had shifted the entire balance. Quiet, composed woman he had discarded was now undeniably more powerful than he could have imagined, and every decision he would make going forward would have to reckon with her influence. Deep inside, he knew He had only just begun to understand the consequences of underestimating her. The following week brought a wave of unexpected developments. Across the city, business partners, investors, and even competitors were scrambling to adjust to the revelation of her identity. Every corner of the financial world was buzzing with analysis, speculation, and admiration. Meanwhile, the wealthy heir felt increasingly trapped in a reality he had not anticipated. He arrived at his office, determined to regain control. The building, once a symbol of his dominance, now felt like a cage. Staff and executives offered polite smiles, but he noticed subtle glances, whispers, and cautious behavior. His decisions were suddenly scrutinized more closely. Partnerships he had taken for granted now faced hesitation or delay. Even minor financial reports seemed more complicated than usual. Something had changed overnight, and he knew it had everything to do with her. At the same time, she continued her work with unwavering focus. From her high-rise office, she monitored the growth of her empire, analyzing global markets, evaluating partnerships, and making precise decisions that would secure her influence for years to come. Every move was calculated, strategic, and invisible to those who didn't understand the full scope of her operations. Her assistant approached with a new report. "Mom, a few companies connected to your network have proposed strategic partnerships that could further expand our reach. Some involve firms that your former husband's company is also connected to." She considered the information carefully, her calm demeanor unchanged. "Schedule a meeting. I want to understand their proposals fully. Ensure that every term aligns with our long-term goals." Back in his office, the heir faced a growing sense of panic. Reports were arriving that highlighted how her influence was already affecting his company's operations. Market movements he had assumed were predictable now seemed tied to decisions made by her empire. Every day that passed without acknowledgement of her power made his position feel more precarious. His colleagues noticed the shift. One executive approached cautiously. "Sir, perhaps we should consider reaching out to her team. Collaboration could help stabilize some ongoing projects." The heir hesitated. Pride and embarrassment waged a war inside him. Asking for guidance from the woman he had publicly humiliated seemed impossible, yet ignoring the situation was clearly no longer an option. Meanwhile, she prepared for a series of high-level meetings. Influence had grown so quickly that leaders from different sectors sought her guidance and approval. Executives who had once viewed her quietly were now aware that she was a force that could not be ignored. Her reputation for strategic brilliance spread even faster than the news of her empire. During one meeting, an investor asked, "Why have you maintained such a private profile for so long? Could have gained public recognition years ago." She smiled slightly, her calm voice steady. Control and influence do not require applause. They require consistency, insight, and patience. Outside the boardroom, reporters speculated on her next moves. Analysts projected her impact on international markets. Social media accounts debated her leadership style and personal story, often highlighting the dignity she had maintained during the public divorce. The wealthy heir watched from a distance as news outlets covered her strategy and influence. Each headline, each report, served as a reminder of the mistake he had made. He had assumed that wealth and status alone would secure his dominance. Yet she had demonstrated something far more powerful: intelligence and the ability to act without seeking validation. Late in the evening, he sat alone in his office, reviewing market reports and company updates. Every decision seemed overshadowed by her influence. He replayed the night of the divorce, every insult and every public display of arrogance, a gnawing regret that had grown impossible to ignore. In contrast, she ended her day with quiet satisfaction. Every decision she made reinforced her growing network. Every partnership, acquisition, and strategic move solidified her position as one of the most powerful leaders in the world. She had not sought revenge, but her very presence reshaped the landscape that he had once believed he controlled. The heir, meanwhile, faced a realization that went beyond financial loss. He had underestimated her entirely. Quiet, composed woman he had dismissed had become a figure whose influence touched his life in ways he could neither ignore nor counter without humility. As night settled over the city, the lights of towering buildings reflected off the streets below. In her office, she prepared for the next day's meetings, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the chaos her revelation had caused in his life. And somewhere, the heir sat staring at the city skyline, aware of one undeniable truth: the woman he had once humiliated now held a power that could not be challenged or reversed. Every choice he would make from this point forward would have to contend with her brilliance, her empire, and the quiet strength he had once failed to recognize. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand what true influence really meant and how far he had fallen behind. The coming days promised challenges he had never faced, in a world that now belonged to someone he had underestimated. The morning air was crisp as the city stirred awake, yet inside the world of finance, a quiet storm was already under. The revelation of the woman's empire had rippled through every sector, creating a mix of awe, curiosity, and strategic recalculations. Investors and executives scrambled to adjust their plans, but she moved with the same calm precision she had always possessed. Nothing about her demeanor betrayed the scale of her influence. Instead, she allowed her results to speak louder than any words ever could. In her office, she reviewed new proposals from partners across the globe. Each file represented billions in potential investments, strategic alliances, or mergers that would expand her reach even further. She didn't rush. Every decision was deliberate, every action measured. Her empire had been built quietly, methodically, and now the world was starting to realize its true magnitude. Meanwhile, the wealthy heir faced the full weight of his previous arrogance. He had assumed that wealth and status alone would protect him, that power could be maintained through appearances. Now, every report, every headline, and every market fluctuation reminded him that he had underestimated someone who had quietly mastered the art of influence, strategy, and he had thought the divorce marked the end of a chapter, known of, but in truth, it had been the beginning of a reckoning. Every move he made now seemed to intersect with her empire. Every decision he took felt measured against the invisible force she had become. The pride that had once fueled him was replaced with a gnawing uncertainty, recognition that he was no longer the most powerful person in the room, or even in his own world. Across town, she prepared for a series of high-level negotiations with international partners. Her calm authority commanded respect. Leaders who had once dismissed her now sought her guidance. Each interaction reinforced the lessons she had demonstrated quietly over the years. Power was not inherited, status was not enough, and influence was earned through vision, intelligence, and unwavering composure. At one meeting, an investor asked pointedly, "How do you manage such a vast network without attracting attention sooner?" She looked directly at him, her voice steady. Because influence is not measured by visibility, but by impact. Real power acts quietly until it must be recognized. Back at his company, the heir struggled to reclaim a sense of control. Meetings felt heavier, negotiations slower, and colleagues more cautious. He realized that the woman he had dismissed was now a factor he could not ignore, and the reality that his previous arrogance had created a vulnerability he could no longer conceal weighed heavily on him. He replayed the night of the divorce endlessly in his mind. Calm way she had removed her ring, the lack of anger or tears, the dignity she displayed, it had all been a warning he had ignored. She had never needed him, she had never relied on his approval, and now the world was recognizing her as the leader she had always been. As evening fell, the city skyline glimmered under the fading sun, a reflection of the lives and empires within it. He reviewed her final reports for the day, ensuring every transaction, every strategic partnership, and every investment aligned with her long-term vision. Her calm demeanor never faltered. A woman who had once been underestimated now orchestrated a network of influence that spanned continents. The heir, in contrast, sat alone in his office, staring at the skyline with a mixture of regret and awe. He had believed that he controlled his world, but the reality was inescapable. He had been outmatched not by wealth, but by vision, intelligence, and quiet strength. The coming days promised new challenges, negotiations, and decisions. Yet, she faced them with the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. He faced them with the awareness that he was no longer the one in command. Every interaction, every partnership, every business decision would now have to contend with her presence, her empire, the brilliance he had failed to recognize. And in that quiet tension, one truth became undeniably clear: underestimating someone's strength can change a life forever. And the woman he had dismissed had just rewritten the rules of power. By the time the heir fully understood the scope of her influence, it was already too late to reclaim what he had once taken for granted. The empire she had built in silence was unstoppable, and the quiet woman who had once seemed ordinary had become the most formidable force he had ever faced. She had chosen focus over recognition, patience over confrontation, and results over drama. And in doing so, she had proven the most important lesson of all: true power is not inherited. It is earned, and it cannot be taken from someone who has already mastered it. The city below glimmered with possibilities, but only one figure at the top had truly claimed them. The heir realized, with a mixture of awe and regret, that he had walked away from someone whose strength and vision had always surpassed his own. And the world was finally paying attention.